I'm Nora Bennett, 35, and for most of my life I believed that if I kept showing up, family would make room for me. I kept a spare set of keys to the beach house in a dish by my front door, the way some people keep a lucky coin. My father used to say that houses remember the hands that shape them, and that memory can outlast any argument. He's gone now, and the rooms we rebuilt together still hold the light exactly the way he wanted, morning pouring in like warm water across wide plank floors. This summer was supposed to be our first without him, the kind of summer where you hold your breath through every tradition and hope it doesn't fall apart. I picked up the phone to confirm dates for the annual family week at the shore, already hearing his voice in the back of my mind telling me to be steady, to be kind, to be brave. By the time the second ring started, I could feel the difference between being included and being tolerated, and I wasn't sure which one was waiting on the other end of the line. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap subscribe if you've ever fought to hold your place in a family that kept shifting the furniture around you. I grew up in small, careful circles of blueprints and coffee rings, a city kid who learned to read elevations before I learned to parallel park. Dad brought me to job sites in a hard hat that slid down my forehead and taught me that integrity is a load-bearing wall you never remove. After my mother died when I was 9, our world shrank to 2 kitchen stools, and the quiet hum of late-night drafting and the values he drilled into me weren't complicated. Tell the truth, take responsibility, and build things that outlast you. When Dad married Valerie, I practiced being gracious because I wanted his second chance to feel steady. She was polished and quick with a smile, the kind of person who knew every maitre d' by name and never seemed surprised by a reserved table. Years later, my half-sister Kayla arrived with the same easy gloss, and our dinners shifted from stories about concrete curing times to talk about launch parties and photo spreads, the conversation sliding toward who was watching and what it looked like. I went to graduate school for architecture and came back to a company that expected me to slide into a corner office. Instead, I rented a tiny studio, opened my own practice, and took on restoration work that smelled like sawdust and history, which is to say it smelled like home. The money was smaller and the hours were long, but I could look a client in the eye knowing every decision served the building and the people who would live in it, not a headline. Dad bought the beach house when I was 16, a weary box with narrow windows that barely acknowledged the ocean, and we spent 2 years transforming it until the horizon felt like a guest at the table. We ripped out walls, raised a span he swore would never sag, and framed the fireplace in pale stone that holds warmth long after the embers dim. That house became a North Star for me, not a prize. When the will was read, Valerie took interim control of the company, Kayla kept her title and a shiny packet of shares, and I received what mattered most, the house placed in a trust that felt like Dad's hand between my shoulder blades. I told myself it was enough that love can be quiet and still count, that you can be part of a family, even if you're not on the invitation list for every photograph. The first weeks after the funeral were a blur of black dresses and speeches about legacy, the kind where the word family is used like ribbon to tie up anything that doesn't fit. I kept showing up anyway, taking my seat at long tables where the silver was heavier than the conversation, listening to Valerie describe new directions for the company in a voice that didn't leave much room for questions. I said little, took the elevator down alone, and went back to my drawings because some problems become clearer when you hold a pencil and remember you know how to make a straight line. What I didn't expect, not really, was how quickly absence could be mistaken for permission. Kayla's posts started to feature long sunsets from the deck, and people called it the family place, as if the deed were just a suggestion. I reminded myself to breathe, to choose patience over pride, to let the first wave pass without bracing for the next, and yet the edge of something sharp stayed with me, a quiet scrape you hear before a storm. Work was steady, a brownstone in Brooklyn, a library retrofit uptown, and I clung to that rhythm the way a good plan can keep your hands busy when your heart is uneasy. When I pressed the phone to my ear that afternoon to confirm our summer week, I told myself it was a simple call, a calendar check, nothing more. I listened to the ring stretching longer than it should, watched the light move across my drafting table like a slow promise, and waited for Valerie to answer. The afternoon sun was sliding across my studio table when the call finally came. Valerie's voice was smooth as glass, the kind of tone that left no space for warmth. "Nora, we're already at the shore," she said, as if that were the most natural sentence in the world. "We only invited family members who actually matter. But you can still be useful. Send the keys to the beach house. Don't make this difficult." For a moment, I couldn't find words. My father's house, the one he and I rebuilt, board by board, was being used as a stage for a family I barely recognized. I kept my voice calm. "You'll have them," I said quietly, then hung up before the anger in her tone could become mine. I sat there for a while looking at the framed sketch of the house that Dad and I had drawn together when I was 16. Every line carried his patience. Every curve of the roof reminded me that beauty and strength could exist in the same design. But in Valerie's hands, even that had become leverage. I reached for my coffee, now cold, and stared at the light falling through the window, thinking how easily people mistake silence for weakness. Later that evening, my phone lit up again, Kayla's name. The text was short, "You're being selfish. Dad would be disappointed." I read it twice before setting the phone face down. I remembered her years ago sitting on my lap as a toddler, tugging on my curls and asking me to read bedtime stories. Somewhere along the way, that closeness had been replaced with photo captions about family legacy and our beach home. I wondered when pretending had started to feel easier for them than remembering. Dinner that week was at a private dining room on Madison Avenue, one of those places with heavy drapes and crystal, so polished you could see your reflection in every fork. I went because part of me still believed attendance counted for something. Valerie was radiant in scarlet silk, Kayla glowing beside her, both surrounded by guests from the firm. I waited until the main course was served before I realized that the conversation wasn't meant to include me. "We're finalizing the Florida expansion," Valerie announced, lifting her wine glass toward a couple across the table. "The financing is delicate but promising." When I asked where the capital was coming from, she didn't even glance at me. "We're exploring options," she said. "Don't trouble yourself, dear." The couple nodded politely, as if I were a distant cousin who'd wandered in by accident. I tried to focus on my meal, on the silver glint of the knife catching the chandelier's light. But all I could hear was the subtle shift of power, my father's chair at the head of the table. Now hers, the conversation looping around her projects, her vision, her name. I excused myself early and stepped outside into the city night-breathing air that didn't smell like perfume and money. The next morning I was reviewing blueprints for a brownstone renovation when the phone rang again. Valerie's voice was sweet, this time too sweet. "We need the beach house for a corporate retreat next month. It's for your father's legacy, Nora." I looked at the drawings on my desk, the careful lines I'd drawn for someone else's home, and then back at the phone. "I have projects scheduled there," I said. "I use the space as my design studio." She let out a long, practiced sigh. "Surely you can work from your apartment for 1 week. These are important clients, the kind of people who keep the company thriving." I swallowed, my pulse steady. "I'm sorry, but the house isn't available." The silence that followed felt colder than winter steel. "I see," she said finally before the call ended. Within minutes, Kayla's messages started again. "This is for all of us. Stop being difficult. You're ruining everything." I turned my phone face down once more and kept working. Some walls you learn not to rebuild. The following week, I showed up to dinner out of habit more than hope. Valerie had brought new guests, a pair of investors from Texas, their accents soft and heavy. "Allison?" She caught herself, then smiled my name as if it were an afterthought. "Nora is still learning about family priorities." The room went still, the air humming with quiet amusement. "She thinks the beach house is hers alone." I set down my fork. "It's in a trust," I said evenly. "I can't just hand it over for business use." Valerie's eyes sparkled. "A trust you control, sweetheart. Don't hide behind paperwork." The guests laughed politely, not realizing they'd just witnessed the first crack in something much larger. When the evening finally ended, I stepped into the night again, the city lights blurring in my vision. I didn't cry, I just walked. My father had taught me that emotion has structure. If you understand its weight, you can carry it without breaking. That night, it felt like the weight of the whole company was sitting on my chest. 3 days later, an email arrived from Carolyn Price, the CFO. "We need to meet." "Not at the office." That line alone told me everything. We met at a small cafe in the West Village, the kind of place where no one looked twice at two women huddled over black coffee. Carolyn looked tired, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled a folder from her bag. "If anyone asks," she said quietly, "this meeting never happened." She slid the papers across the table, bank statements, withdrawals from the Bennett Foundation accounts columns of numbers that didn't belong. I traced the lines with my finger, my breath catching at the totals. "What am I looking at?" I asked. "Unauthorized transfers," she whispered. "Valerie's been moving money out of the foundation. Marketing expenses, family hardship loans, no invoices, no approval. Over $500,000 in 18 months. I stared at the numbers again, trying to find logic in them. "Why are you showing me this?" Carolyn met my eyes. "Because your father trusted me to protect what he built, and I can't do that alone anymore." When she stood to leave, she pushed a small flash drive toward me. "Everything's on here. If anything happens to me, take it to Martin Hale." She didn't say goodbye, just walked out into the late afternoon crowd, her gray coat vanishing into motion. By the time I reached Martin's office, the city had already gone dark. His waiting room smelled like leather and dusted wood polish, the kind of old money calm that made people confess without meaning to. I spread Carolyn's papers across his desk, and he read in silence. When he finally looked up, his expression wasn't surprise, it was confirmation. "Your father anticipated this," he said, walking to a file cabinet and pulling out a thick folder. 3 months before he died, he revised his will. He pointed to a paragraph dense with legal language. "If any beneficiary attempts to deprive another of their rightful inheritance through fraud or coercion, they forfeit everything. It's airtight." I sat back, the words settling like stone. If I can prove she's misused the foundation and tried to pressure me, she loses it all. Martin nodded slowly. "Her inheritance, her shares, her seat on the board, everything reverts to you." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he reached into the folder again and pulled out a sealed envelope, my name written across it in my father's hand. "He left this for you," he said, "to be opened when you need his strength." I held the envelope carefully, the paper soft from age. My father's handwriting was familiar, the steady, deliberate strokes of a man who believed in blueprints more than words. I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I tucked it into my bag, knowing instinctively that whatever came next would require every ounce of that strength. That night I called Sarah. We'd been friends since college, both obsessed with buildings and balance sheets. When I told her everything, she didn't interrupt. She just listened, the sound of city traffic threading through the phone line. "Nora," she said finally, "if you act on that clause, it's war. Valerie will come for you and Kayla will follow. Are you sure you're ready?" I looked at the sealed envelope on my desk, the faint shadow of my father's name under lamplight. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I think he knew this day would come." Outside, the city was restless, the kind of night when windows flicker like eyes that can't stay shut. Somewhere in a house that should have been mine alone, Valerie and Kayla were raising glasses to their version of family, to their future, built on my father's foundation. And I knew as I turned off the light that the next time I spoke to them, the conversation would not be about vacations or dinner plans. It would be about consequences. I didn't open my father's letter that night. It sat on my desk like a heartbeat under paper, waiting for the moment I'd need it most. The days that followed blurred together a quiet rhythm of work and long walks through the city, the kind that kept me from thinking too hard. I told myself to stay patient, to let the facts speak before the anger did, but patience has its limits. Valerie wasn't slowing down. A week later she called again, her voice syrup smooth, pretending the last argument had never happened. "Nora, let's talk about the summer trip," she said. "We're planning the family week at the beach house for July 15th through the 22nd. I wanted to give you the dates early so you can clear your calendar." She spoke like a woman offering a courtesy, not a demand. I agreed to check my schedule even though I knew the house wouldn't host them again. Her tone softened. "It's important we all come together for your father's memory. Kayla's bringing her fiancé, it'll be a family milestone." When the call ended, I sat for a long moment turning her words over in my mind. Every time she said family, it sounded more like a weapon than a comfort. Still, I said nothing. I wanted to see what they would do next. The answer came a week later in the form of an Instagram post. Kayla had shared a photo of the house, the deck glowing in the evening light. Her caption read, "Can't wait for our annual Bennett family retreat. Family first always." Dozens of comments followed praise for the view for the family home, for how blessed she was. I scrolled until the words blurred. The post wasn't an invitation, it was a declaration. The next morning, a call came from a catering company in Southampton. The woman on the other end was cheerful. "Hi, this is Jenna from Bayview Catering. Mrs. Carr asked me to confirm the delivery schedule and gate codes for July 15th through the 22nd. We'll need access for 12 guests." My pen froze halfway through a note. "I'm sorry," I said. "There's been a mistake. I didn't authorize any event." The woman hesitated. "Mrs. Carr said this was the family home. She already paid the deposit, $15,000. I thanked her, took the details, and hung up. By the time I reached the company's main office, the paperwork had already been processed. Valerie had signed the contract herself. I called her immediately. "You booked catering for 12 people in my house," I said. Her voice was calm-clipped. "It's a family vacation and a business opportunity. Don't overreact. You don't have permission to use the property for business events." "It's not a business event," she replied. "It's family hosting friends." Her sigh came through the line. "Unless you plan to ban your own sister from visiting, stop making this difficult. Your father would be ashamed of how selfish you've become." There it was, again his name used like a hammer. "Valerie," I said carefully, "you don't have the right to use the house that way." Her voice dropped lower. "You have two choices, Nora. Be part of this family or be alone, but you don't get to have it both ways." Then the line went dead. I stared at the silent phone, the pulse of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. She had backed me into a corner with words that sounded like unity, but were built on control. I remembered Martin's calm voice across his desk, the legal clause that could change everything, and the flash drive Carolyn had risked her job to hand me. I walked to my drafting table, opened the folder of trust documents, and began to read. Each line was deliberate, my father's caution written into every paragraph. The house wasn't just mine, it was protected by language that allowed no interference, no transfer, no shared ownership. The trust stood like steel. The forfeiture clause sat beneath it, simple and final. If Valerie or Kayla attempted to take what wasn't theirs, they would lose everything tied to my father's estate. I called Martin the next morning. "I need official copies of the clause," I told him, notarized and sealed. There was a pause. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Once you activate this, there's no going back." I looked toward the envelope on my desk, my father's handwriting still unbroken. "They made their choice," I said. "I'm making mine." The paperwork arrived within 24 hours. I spent that night reviewing every page, marking each reference to the foundation, the trust, and the estate's conditions. Then I called Carolyn. "If this moves forward, are you willing to testify?" Her voice was steady. "Yes, I can't watch this continue." "Thank you," I said. "James will reach out." She corrected me softly. "It's Carolyn, and I'm ready." When I finally opened my father's letter, the paper felt fragile under my hands. His handwriting filled the page, strong, deliberate, familiar. "If you're reading this, it means you're facing a choice I hoped you'd never have to make. I built this company with my hands, but I built you with my heart. You are my greatest achievement." My throat tightened as I read. "Valerie loves power. Kayla loves comfort. But you, my girl, you love truth. Protect what matters. The house is not just property, it's a test. If they come for it, they've forgotten what family means. Don't let them make you small." Inside the envelope was a photograph Dad and me standing in front of the half-finished beach house, our smiles wide the ocean behind us. I placed it beside my drafting tools, the smell of paper and salt air returning like a memory. By the next morning, I had everything ready. Martin's courier would deliver a small package to Valerie's home in the Hamptons. Inside were the spare keys she'd demanded, and a manila envelope sealed with his law firm's crest. The documents were precise, notarized copies of the forfeiture clause, the trust agreement, the foundation's account statements, and a cover letter summarizing her violations. I added one short note on my stationery as requested. Please read the enclosed materials carefully. When the courier left, I didn't watch the tracking updates. I spent the day with the client reviewing layouts for a community library renovation. At lunch, Sarah joined me listening as I described the plan. "You did what needed to be done," she said, squeezing my hand. I nodded but said nothing. Some victories are too heavy to celebrate. That evening, the tracking email arrived. Delivered, signed by V. Carr. I closed my laptop, turned off the lights, and watched the city outside my window settle into dusk. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. An hour later, my phone rang. I answered. There was nothing at first, just breathing shallow and fast. Then Valerie's voice tight with fury. "What is this?" she demanded. "The documents you should have read 6 months ago," I said evenly. "The trust agreement, the forfeiture clause. This is bias. Martin works for you. He worked for my father for 30 years, I said. Everything in that packet is legal and binding. The foundation board has copies." "You're bluffing," she said, her voice cracking. "You can't prove anything." I stayed quiet. Then she said the words that ended it. I was going to pay it back. It was just a loan. My eyes closed. The foundation doesn't allow personal loans. You know that. There was a pause, then a low, unsteady sound that barely resembled her voice. "We gave you everything," she whispered. "You included me," I corrected. "You're standing in my house without permission." A sudden noise erupted on her end, a sharp cry followed by Kayla's panicked voice. "Mom, what's wrong?" Then Valerie shouted, "Everyone out! The trip is over!" The call disconnected, leaving only silence on my side of the line. I stared out at the skyline, the lights glinting off glass towers my father once helped design, and felt something shift. It wasn't triumph. It was the sound of balance returning quiet and sure. Valerie had spent years believing she could erase me with charm and influence. She never understood that blueprints don't vanish, they wait. When I turned off the lamp, the photo on my desk caught the faint glow from the window. My father's smile looked the same as it had that summer, steady and proud. Tomorrow, the fallout would begin. Tonight, for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The call from Valerie had ended in silence, but the echo of her voice stayed with me for hours. I sat on the edge of my sofa, staring at the city lights through the window, feeling the slow pulse of something new resolve. I had spent years pretending that calm would be enough to keep peace, that patience might build bridges. But some people only see quiet as surrender. That night, surrounded by rolled blueprints and the steady hum of traffic below, I began tracing a different kind of plan, one that would hold even under pressure. The next morning, I met Martin at his office. His assistant brought coffee but didn't linger. He looked at me with the same careful steadiness I remembered from my father's meetings. "It started," he said. I nodded. She crossed the line. He opened his briefcase and handed me a folder thick with forms. "You've done your part. Now it's my turn. I'll file the initial notice and prepare a timeline. You'll need to document every exchange, texts, emails, call records. This needs to be airtight." I reached into my bag and pulled out my father's letter, folded but uncreased. Martin's eyes softened when he saw the handwriting. "He knew, didn't he?" I said quietly. He suspected what she'd try. Martin nodded once. "Your father understood people better than most. He hoped she'd never push you this far. But he made sure you'd have what you needed if she did." I left his office with a strange calm, like stepping onto solid ground after months of drifting. On the sidewalk, the city noise felt muted. I walked toward Sarah's building in Chelsea, the folder pressed to my chest, as if it carried air instead of paper. When she opened her apartment door, her hair was tied back, and her kitchen table was already covered with casebooks and a legal pad. "You're ready?" she said simply. I nodded, and together we began laying everything out, dates, amounts, and the network of choices that had brought us here. For hours, we worked in quiet focus. When we finished, Sarah leaned back, scanning the pages. "They've left fingerprints everywhere," she said. "The foundation withdrawals, the catering contracts, even that catering deposit. It's all traceable." She tapped her pen against the edge of the table. "The clause gives you leverage, but truth will carry this further. Don't speak to them again without documentation. Every word needs to count." By the time I left her apartment, dusk had turned the city amber. I took the long way home, walking past the river where the water reflected the skyline. My phone buzzed once Kayla's name again, but I didn't open the message. I had already heard everything she wanted to say, just in different words. 3 days passed before the quiet broke. The courier confirmed delivery at 4:37 p.m., signed by V. Carr. I thanked him and hung up my voice steady. Sarah called an hour later. "She got it," she said. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I replied, and I was. When the phone rang again that evening, the number was familiar. Valerie didn't speak at first. I could hear the sharp rhythm of her breathing, the kind that comes when control begins to slip. "Did you receive the keys?" I asked. "What is this?" she demanded. "Those are legal documents," I said. "You should read them carefully." She laughed a dry, humorless sound. "You think you can scare me with paperwork?" "No," I said. "With truth." There was a long pause. I could hear faint voices in the background music, the clatter of glasses. Then her tone shifted. "This is bias. Martin always favored your father. You can't use him against me. He served the estate, not me," I answered. "And the documents have already been filed with the foundation board. You're bluffing." Her words came out strained, thinner than before. "You don't have proof of anything." I let the silence stretch until she filled it. "I was going to pay it back," she said suddenly. "It was a loan." The words landed like a confession. "You know that's not allowed," I said. "Those funds were never yours to use." The sound that followed didn't belong to the woman who had spent years orchestrating perfection. It was raw and broken. "We gave you everything," she said, her voice cracking. "You included me," I replied quietly. "You're in my house without permission." There was shouting in the background, Kayla's voice anxious and confused. "Mom, what's happening?" Then came the unmistakable sound of a glass shattering. "Everyone out." Valerie's voice was sharp, shrill, unrecognizable. "Get out." "The trip is over." The line went dead. I sat still, the phone cooling in my hand. Somewhere miles away, the sound of her empire cracking had filled a house that wasn't hers. It wasn't victory I felt. It was release, the kind of stillness that comes when something heavy finally breaks free. The next morning, Martin called. "Valerie's attorney reached out," he said. "They're claiming you orchestrated all of this. Refused reasonable family requests to provoke a reaction." I opened my laptop. "They can claim whatever they want. Every email, every message, they initiated all of it." He sighed. "They'll make noise, but the evidence is solid. The foundation board meets in 3 weeks. That's when the real decisions begin." I looked at the stack of files on my desk, the timelines neatly labeled. "File the petition," I said. "Let's move forward." Later that day, Kayla called. Her message came through in a rush of tears and static. I didn't know she said. "Mom said everything was authorized. She said you were trying to hurt the company." I didn't respond. Some truths need silence more than argument. When the sun set that evening, I walked down to the river again. The water was calm, the tide barely moving. For months I had tried to hold my family together by staying small, by bending until I fit the shape they wanted. But I realized then that my father hadn't raised me to shrink. He had built me to stand. The lights along the bridge came on one by one, glowing in the dusk. My phone buzzed once more, Sarah checking in, but I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, the cool air off the water brushing against my skin, and thought of my father's words, "Don't let anyone make you small." Valerie's downfall had started with a letter she hadn't written and a house she thought she owned. The rest would come soon enough. The board would meet, the truth would be read into record, and the walls she'd built on deceit would finally give way. I didn't need to rush it. When I finally turned back toward home, the city felt lighter somehow, like a building that had been waiting for someone to remove the weight from its frame. I didn't know exactly what the next weeks would bring, lawyers' hearings, public whispers, but I knew what my father would have said if he'd been standing beside me. "Stay steady, Nora. The truth doesn't need to shout." And for the first time in years, I believed him. The morning after Valerie's meltdown, the city woke in gray light. I made coffee, opened the curtains, and felt the air shift calm, but charged like the moment before a storm fully breaks. I knew what had happened at the beach house would ripple outward. People like Valerie didn't disappear quietly. They regrouped. By noon, Martin called. "She's bringing in counsel," he said. "They're trying to argue that you provoked her, that refusing to share the house was unreasonable." I leaned back in my chair, looking at the skyline outside my window. "Do they really want to put that on record?" He sighed. "They'll make noise. It's their only move. But the board meets soon, and that's where the evidence will land." That night, I reviewed every document again. I printed messages, dated call logs, even screenshots of Kayla's posts claiming the house as the family's retreat. I created folders for everything proof of misuse, Financial Trails Foundation withdrawals. Each piece of paper had a story, and together they painted the truth my father had prepared me to defend. 3 days later, I met Carolyn at a quiet cafe downtown. She arrived early, her coat buttoned tight despite the warm weather. When I sat down, she slid a thick envelope across the table. "You should see the full picture," she said softly. Inside were fresh bank records, withdrawals totaling nearly $600,000. Marketing expenses, family loans, consulting fees, she explained. No approvals, no receipts. She looked up, her eyes steady. "I've been keeping copies off-site. Your father trusted me to protect what he built. I won't let her bury it." Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her coffee cup. "Are you ready for what comes next?" "I am," I said. "And I'll make sure you're protected too." Later that afternoon, I met Martin in his office to deliver Carolyn's records. The documents sprawled across his desk in tidy chaos. "This will do it," he said, after a long silence. "But there's something else." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a letter from the Foundation's legal team, an official notice scheduling an internal hearing. They'll review the misuse of funds. If they confirm embezzlement, it activates the forfeiture clause automatically. I read the date 3 weeks away, the same night as the Foundation's annual gala. I closed the folder slowly. "So it ends where it began," I murmured. In the following days, the story deepened. Sarah spent evenings with me at my apartment, combing through legal filings and news clippings. We discovered that Valerie had already been promoting a major Florida development, $45 million in projected revenue. The funding breakdown listed $10 million from internal capital reserves. Sarah traced the source. "That's the foundation money," she said quietly. "She used it to back the Florida deal." As I read the documents, a single line stopped me cold: collateral, to be drawn from existing Bennett family assets. The beach house. Valerie hadn't wanted it for a vacation. She'd wanted it as collateral for a commercial loan. If I had transferred ownership even temporarily, my father's home would have been tied to a debt that wasn't mine. I called Martin immediately. "She planned to use the house to secure the Florida loan," I said. "I can prove it." I emailed him the evidence. Minutes later, his reply came, "This is intent to defraud. It changes everything." The next morning, Sarah and I finalized my petition to the board. Every page was labeled, time-stamped, and cross-referenced. When I signed the final line, she looked at me for a long moment. "You're calm," she said. "I thought you'd feel relieved." I smiled faintly. "I'm not relieved yet. I'm prepared." The gala approached faster than I expected. Invitations arrived, printed in ivory and gold, embossed with the Foundation's crest. Valerie's name topped the list as host and keynote speaker. I received mine by courier, no personal note, just protocol. The irony wasn't lost on me. The night before the event, Sarah came over with takeout and a garment bag. "You need to look composed, not combative," she said. Inside was a simple black Dior gown, elegant but understated. I smiled. "You know me too well." She helped me press the fabric, then poured us each a glass of wine. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked. "Once you go public, there's no undoing it." I thought of my father's letter, the way he'd written, "You have every right to take up space." I nodded. It's time. When the night arrived, I walked into the plaza's grand ballroom alone. The space glowed under chandeliers, a sea of sequined dresses and black tuxedos. A string quartet played softly near the entrance, their music steady and dignified. I felt eyes turn as I passed some curious others, wary. Everyone had heard the rumors. Across the room, Valerie stood near the stage in a crimson gown, her diamond necklace catching the light. Kayla hovered close, her smile too tight. The crowd parted as I moved toward them. Nora, Valerie said brightly, her voice carrying just enough warmth to fool the untrained ear. "How lovely you could join us." "I wouldn't miss it," I said. Kayla's eyes darted between us. "Mom," maybe she began, but Valerie cut her off. "We'll speak after the speeches," she said. "Privately." I nodded once. "I'll be at the board meeting upstairs." "You're welcome to join." Her expression faltered for just a second. Then she smiled again, sharp and polished. "Enjoy the evening," she said, turning away. Dinner passed in a blur of conversation I barely heard. My mind was on the documents in my purse, the copies of every transaction Carolyn had uncovered. At my table, Sarah's hand rested briefly on mine, grounding me. Across the room, I saw board members whispering, faces familiar from years of my father's work. They knew something was coming. When the lights dimmed, Valerie took the stage. The applause was immediate, polite, hollow. "This foundation meant everything to my husband," she began. "And it continues to mean everything to me." Her voice wavered just enough to sound human. "Thomas built this company on integrity and family unity. Tonight, I'm honored to announce a new commitment, $2 million to youth education programs across New York." The room clapped, cameras flashed. Valerie smiled, her performance flawless. "Thomas always said, family is everything. His legacy lives on through both my daughters, Kayla and Nora." Her gaze flickered toward me, soft but controlled. I didn't look away. When the applause faded, I stood. "Excuse me," I said to my table mates. "I have a meeting upstairs." Sarah rose with me. We crossed the ballroom toward the elevator, passing guests who lowered their voices as we went by. The air inside the elevator was cool and quiet. "You did well," Sarah said as the doors closed. "Now let the evidence do the talking." When we reached the third-floor salon, Martin and Carolyn were already waiting along with several board members. The room smelled faintly of leather and old wood, the kind of space where important decisions had been made for decades. I placed my folder on the table, every page a line of defense drawn in ink and intent. The board chair, a silver-haired man named Thomas Hartwell, called the session to order. "Miss Bennett," he said, "please present your case." I took a breath and began, my voice even and clear. "My father created this foundation to serve the community, not to fund private interests. Over the past 18 months, $587,000 has been withdrawn for unauthorized purposes." Gasps moved quietly around the table. I handed out copies of the records. The withdrawals were approved by Mrs. Carr and in 2 instances co-signed by Ms. Carr. No invoices, no contracts, no board oversight. Valerie entered mid-sentence, her heels striking the marble floor. "This is a family dispute," she declared. "It's being blown out of proportion." Robert Chen, one of the board members, leaned forward. "With all due respect, $500,000 isn't a family matter. It's a violation of trust." Valerie's face reddened. "I intended to repay it." Lisa Tran, a nonprofit attorney on the board, shook her head. "Intent doesn't erase misuse." The silence that followed felt like stone. Thomas Hartwell folded his hands. "We'll deliberate immediately. Please step outside while we vote." As we waited in the hallway, Kayla approached, her voice trembling. "Nora, I didn't know. Mom said it was for the company. She said Dad used to do it too." I met her eyes. "He never touched foundation funds for personal use. Ever." She swallowed hard, tears brimming. "You're going to ruin us." I shook my head. "No, Kayla. You did that the moment you chose her version of the truth." The doors opened again. Martin gestured for me to return. The board members had voted unanimously, Valerie removed as CEO, the forfeiture clause formally activated. I exhaled slowly, feeling the air shift again, not with relief, but with certainty. As Valerie was escorted out, she stopped beside me. Her voice was low, seething. "Your father would be ashamed of you." I met her gaze. "No," I said quietly. "He'd be proud I remembered what he taught me." When the door closed behind her, the room was still. I turned to Martin. "It's done," I said. He nodded. "It's only the beginning." Outside, the night air was cool and sharp, carrying the faint echo of music from the ballroom below. Sarah walked beside me in silence, her hand brushing mine in quiet solidarity. I didn't speak until we reached the curb. "Tomorrow," I said, "the rebuilding starts." She smiled faintly. "You already started, Nora. Tonight." The room stayed quiet for a long time after the vote. The hum of the city below filtered faintly through the old windows, mixing with the soft rustle of papers being gathered. Valerie's chair scraped against the floor as she stood, her face a mask of disbelief. She leaned toward me, her voice low and sharp. "You think this makes you noble? You've destroyed everything your father built." I met her eyes steady but tired. "No," I said. "I'm protecting it." Security waited by the door as she walked out. Kayla followed behind, pale and silent, her gaze fixed on the carpet. When the doors closed, the air felt different, cleaner somehow. Thomas Hartwell broke the silence first. "Miss Bennett, he said your father once told me you'd be the one to steady the ship if it ever drifted." His tone carried the calm weight of approval. "You did that tonight." Martin gathered his folders and nodded toward me. "It'll take a few weeks for the legal filings to be finalized," he said, "but the outcome is clear." I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle slowly. The fight was over, but the rebuilding had only begun. When I stepped outside, the night air met me like cold water. Downstairs, the ballroom lights still glowed, the last of the gala guests slipping into waiting cars. Sarah was waiting by the curb, her coat pulled tight against the wind. She didn't say anything, just fell into step beside me as we crossed the plaza. We walked until the music faded behind us, our heels echoing against the stone. Finally, she spoke. "You handled it with grace," she said. "He'd be proud." I looked up at the skyline, the city my father had helped shape. "He taught me that integrity isn't loud," I said quietly. "It just has to hold." The weeks that followed unfolded in slow motion. The foundation's auditors confirmed everything, every missing dollar, every falsified note, every transfer disguised as marketing. Martin's office handled the court filings, and the forfeiture clause moved through probate without challenge. Valerie's attorneys blustered at first, but their arguments collapsed under the weight of documented facts. Within 6 weeks, the judgment became official. Valerie and Kayla forfeited all rights to my father's estate, the company's shares, and their foundation seats. When Martin called with the confirmation, I was sitting at my drafting table, tracing sunlight across a set of blueprints. "It's done," he said. The court upheld everything. I didn't speak right away. Relief came quietly, like air filling a room that had been sealed too long. "What happens to the shares?" I asked. "They revert to the estate," he replied, "which means they're yours." The number felt distant, almost abstract control of 75% of Bennett Development. "I don't want to run the company," I said after a moment. Martin chuckled softly. "You don't have to. You can appoint leadership, restructure, or sell. That's what your father intended to give you choices." A week later, I met with Carolyn in the same conference room where so many arguments had started. She looked different, lighter, unburdened. "The audit's complete," she said, sliding a report across the table. "We've implemented full transparency measures, quarterly reviews, outside accountants, automatic dual approvals for large transactions. It's the foundation your father wanted." I smiled, reading the summary. "You did this," I said. "We did," she corrected. Not long after, a letter arrived at Martin's office addressed to me in Kayla's handwriting. He called before forwarding it. "Do you want to see it?" he asked. I hesitated, then said, "Yes." The envelope arrived the next morning, the writing uneven but careful. "Nora, I know you have no reason to forgive me. I believed Mom when she said everything was authorized. I didn't question it, and that's on me. You were right. She used both of us. I've moved to California to start over. I'm trying to be better. I hope someday we can talk, even if it's not soon. Kayla." I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in my desk drawer. I didn't answer, not yet. Some apologies need time, and I needed to see what she built before deciding if words were enough. By early fall, the company had a new CEO, a woman named Evelyn Ward, chosen for her record of ethical management and quiet strength. She'd spent 20 years leading sustainable development projects, the kind of work that aligned with my father's original values. "I won't rebuild an empire," she said during our first meeting, "but I will build trust." That was all I needed to hear. At the foundation, I accepted the board's offer to serve as interim trustee. It wasn't power I wanted. It was protection for the legacy that had already survived too much. We launched an internal review of all grant recipients, reinstated programs Valerie had cut, and introduced scholarships for first-generation architecture students. Carolyn became the new chief operating officer. Her leadership met with unanimous support. The press eventually caught the story, but I kept my name out of it. The headlines read, "Bennett Foundation implements sweeping reforms after internal audit." Valerie's name appeared briefly at the bottom, noted for past irregularities. Mine didn't appear at all. That's how I wanted it. Work at my practice continued quietly. Clients still called, projects still came, and life began to return to a rhythm that made sense. Sometimes I caught myself standing at the window of my office watching the cranes move across the skyline, remembering the years when my father would point out each one as if it were an artist's brushstroke. One Saturday morning, I drove out to the beach house for the first time since everything ended. The air smelled of salt and pine, the waves calm against the sand. Inside the house was still exactly as I'd left it. The wide glass walls, the limestone hearth, the light falling across the floorboards we'd chosen together. On the mantel sat the photograph of us taken during construction. He was holding a blueprint. I was holding the other end. I stood there for a long time, remembering the weight of that paper, and how he'd said, "Design something that can stand on its own, even if you're not there to hold it." Before leaving, I opened the windows to let the sea air in. For the first time in years, the space didn't feel haunted by absence. It felt lived in by memory, by endurance, by peace. When I returned to the city, Martin called. "The board finalized your appointment," he said. "You're officially the foundation's permanent trustee." I thanked him, though the words didn't feel big enough. "And there's one more thing," he added. "Thomas Hartwell wanted me to tell you he's retiring next year. He said it's fitting to leave the foundation in the hands of the person Richard trusted most." That night, I sat on my balcony overlooking the river, the same view I'd walked beside all those evenings when this fight began. The city lights shimmered against the dark water, steady and sure. I thought of everything my father had built, every wall, every structure, every principle, and how in the end it wasn't the company or the property that mattered most. It was the integrity behind them. Sarah called just before midnight. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like the foundation's finally solid," I said. She laughed softly. Pun intended. I smiled. Always. We talked about small things after that, the next project, the change in seasons, the way the city smells different when fall begins. But as we hung up, I looked around my quiet apartment and realized something had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for the next crisis. I was living in the aftermath, the place where rebuilding truly starts. The house was safe, the company restored, and my father's legacy intact. Yet the story wasn't finished. There were still pieces left to place reconciliation, renewal, maybe even forgiveness. I didn't know when or how that would come. But as the wind from the river lifted through the open window, I knew it would. And when it did, I'd be ready to meet it standing steady just as he taught me. It took months for everything to settle after the hearing. The press eventually lost interest, the company moved forward under Evelyn's quiet leadership, and the foundation returned to the kind of work my father had always imagined. But justice has a rhythm of its own. It doesn't end when the noise fades. It keeps unfolding quietly in the places where truth takes root. By winter, the financial restitution was complete. Valerie's personal accounts were drained to repay misused funds, and her name was formally removed from every record tied to the Bennett estate. The forfeiture clause had done its job exactly as my father intended. When Martin called with the final confirmation, he said simply, "It's over." I thought about that word for a long time after hanging up. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning I hadn't planned for. At the company, Evelyn brought a steadiness that reminded me of my father. Meetings started on time, decisions were clear, and no one raised their voice. I visited once a week sometimes just to listen as she and Carolyn outlined projects for affordable housing and historic restoration. They asked for my input on design from time to time, but mostly they just wanted reassurance that I approved of the direction. "Your father's principles guide this place again," Carolyn told me one afternoon. "It's as if the company finally found its heartbeat." Meanwhile, the foundation began receiving letters from past grant recipients, students, small business owners, community architects, each one thanking us for programs Valerie had cut years earlier. Reading those letters in my office became a quiet ritual, one that reminded me why my father had started the foundation in the first place. It wasn't about prestige. It was about people who needed a chance. One morning, Martin stopped by with an envelope from the court's escrow office. "This is the final distribution," he said. Inside was a single check representing the remainder of my father's estate. "He planned for this," Martin added, "said it was meant for you to decide how legacy should look." That evening I walked down to the waterfront with the envelope still unopened in my hand. The air was sharp and the sky hung low with winter clouds. I thought of my father's voice the way he'd say, "Measure twice, cut once." It wasn't just about carpentry, it was about care. I made the decision before I even reached home. The next week, the board approved my proposal for the Bennett Scholarship for Ethical Design, a program offering full tuition for students committed to community architecture. Carolyn smiled when I presented it. "That's exactly what Thomas would have done," she said. In February, I received a call I didn't expect. Kayla's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it ring out, but something in me said to answer. Her voice was hesitant, thinner than I remembered. "Hi, Nora," she said. "I heard about the scholarship. It's beautiful. Thank you," I said carefully. "I've been working," she went on. "A nonprofit in San Diego took me on for communications work. It's not glamorous, but it feels honest. I wanted to thank you for not destroying everything." Her words caught slightly on the last phrase. "I didn't destroy anything," I said softly. "I just stopped it from falling apart." There was a long pause. "I know," she said finally. "I've been in therapy. Mom isn't talking to me anymore. She blames me for not fighting harder. But I think she's just angry at herself." I didn't answer right away. Some truths don't need echoing. "I'm glad you're working," I said at last. "Keep building something that belongs to you." She let out a shaky breath. "Would you ever come out here just to visit?" "Maybe," I said, "when it feels right." After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the quiet, the phone still warm in my hand. There was sadness in her voice, but there was something else too, accountability. And that mattered. By spring, the first round of scholarship applications poured in. Students from across the country wrote about building accessible parks, sustainable housing, and schools that doubled as community centers. Their words carried a kind of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. Reading them, I realized that what my father built had evolved beyond concrete and glass. It had become a blueprint for integrity itself. The company's annual report arrived in March, bound in navy leather. Inside, a dedication page bore a single line, "In memory of Thomas Bennett, whose foundations were built to last." I ran my fingers over the embossed letters, remembering how my father used to hum when he worked, measuring, aligning, perfecting every angle until it fit just right. A few weeks later, Sarah convinced me to take a break. "You've spent half a year saving everyone else's legacy," she said. "Take 1 week and remember yours." We drove to Maine, where she'd rented a small cabin overlooking the coast. For the first time in what felt like years, I let my shoulders drop. We spent the days walking through pine trails and the evenings near the fire, the sound of waves filling the silence between conversations. One night I told her about Kayla's call. "Do you think you'll forgive her?" she asked. I thought for a moment before answering. "Forgiveness isn't a door you walk through," once I said. "It's a room you keep walking into a little farther each time." When I returned to New York, a package waited at my door. The return address read, Kayla Carr, San Diego, California. Inside was a small wooden box. Beneath the lid, wrapped in tissue, was a photograph I hadn't seen in years, Kayla and me as children on the beach, building a sandcastle beside my father. She'd written on the back in blue ink, "We can start rebuilding when you're ready." I set it on the mantel beside the photo of my father and me at the house construction site. Two pieces of the same story, separated by time and choices, finally resting in the same light. That night, I visited the beach house again. The ocean was calm, the moon bright enough to silver the water. I walked the deck barefoot, the boards cool under my feet. Inside, the fireplace crackled, and the house felt alive again. I poured a cup of tea, sat on the steps, and listened to the tide. Justice had been served months ago, but this quiet peace felt like something deeper. It wasn't revenge or triumph. It was balance. The kind my father used to talk about when explaining how to anchor a foundation so it could withstand storms. He used to say, the strength of a building isn't in how tall it stands. It's in how well it stays upright when everything around it shifts. I looked out toward the horizon, the same stretch of ocean that had once witnessed my family's unraveling. Somewhere beyond it, Kayla was starting again. And here in the house my father and I built, I was too. The company would continue to grow. The foundation would fund new dreams. And the past, every betrayal, every wound would slowly fade into something useful, like reclaimed wood carrying new weight with grace. When I finally closed the windows and turned off the lights, the house was quiet, steady, and whole. Tomorrow, I'd meet with the scholarship's first recipients. But for now, in the hush of the ocean and the warmth of the fire, I felt something settle deep inside me. It wasn't just closure. It was the life my father had wanted for me all along, one built on truth, resilience, and peace that no one could take away. Spring eased into summer quietly, and for the first time in years, life didn't feel like something I had to brace against. The scholarship program was running smoothly, dozens of students already enrolled, each one carrying a piece of my father's legacy forward. The company was thriving under Evelyn's leadership, and the foundation's new projects were rebuilding neighborhoods once forgotten. Every structure, every design felt like a living continuation of what my father started. One afternoon, I visited the foundation's new office downtown. The walls were lined with photos of completed projects, schools, housing developments, community centers, all touched by the people who believed in doing good work for the right reasons. Carolyn met me at the door with her familiar, calm smile. "You should see this," she said, handing me a small box. Inside was a brass nameplate engraved with Thomas Bennett Foundation in honor of a legacy rebuilt. She watched my expression carefully. "We thought it belonged in the lobby." My throat tightened, but I nodded. "He'd like that," I said quietly. Later that week, I drove out to the beach house again. The air smelled of salt and lilac, the early summer breeze carrying that steady rhythm of the ocean. I hadn't seen the house since the scholarship ceremony, and stepping through the door felt like returning to a place that finally recognized me. The furniture had been polished, the walls repainted in the same pale tones my father had chosen years before. Sunlight poured across the floorboards we'd laid together, warm and steady. I brought a stack of the students' thank you letters and sat by the window reading them aloud one by one. Their handwriting varied, some neat and deliberate, others scattered and energetic, but the message was the same: gratitude, hope, and the promise to keep building with integrity. Somewhere between the pages, I found myself smiling. That evening, I walked out onto the deck with a cup of coffee and let the sound of the waves fill the silence. I thought about how far everything had come, the chaos, the betrayal, the long months of hearings and rebuilding, and how something so painful had somehow led to peace. It wasn't the kind of victory people write headlines about. It was quieter than that. It was knowing I had kept my father's promise to protect what mattered, to stand tall, even when the ground shifted beneath me. My phone buzzed softly on the railing. A message from Kayla. "Thinking of you. The ocean's beautiful here tonight. Hope you're doing well." I typed back, "It's beautiful here too." For a moment, I imagined her standing on another shore, looking at the same stretch of horizon. Maybe one day we'd meet again and talk not as rivals or reminders of loss, but as sisters who finally learned how to stand on their own. As the sky darkened, I lit the old lantern my father used to hang near the steps. Its glow caught the edges of the porch railing, soft and golden against the fading light. I whispered a quiet thank you to him, to the home we built, to the lessons that held long after he was gone. When the wind shifted, I could almost hear his voice again, steady and sure. "Build things that last." And I finally understood. He hadn't meant just walls or beams. He meant integrity. He meant compassion. He meant a kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself to anyone. I stayed out there until the stars came out, thinking about the people who'd stood beside me through it all: Martin, Sarah, Carolyn, and how each of them had been part of the foundation that helped me rebuild. Justice had come, yes, but what followed was something even greater: balance, the kind my father built his life around. When I finally closed the door that night, I felt a peace I hadn't known since I was a child, sitting on the floor of his workshop, listening to the sound of his pencil scratching across blueprints, the same sound that started all of this. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that strength doesn't always roar. It often arrives in quiet choices, steady hands, and the decision to do what's right when no one's watching. Sometimes justice isn't loud or vengeful. Sometimes it's a whisper that says, "You stood your ground," and that was enough. As I turned off the lights, the lantern's glow lingered against the window. I knew then that my father's legacy wasn't just in the company or the house, it was in the calm that follows after you've chosen truth over comfort. Before I went to bed, I looked out at the ocean one last time. The tide had come in, brushing softly against the shore. The world felt steady again. Thank you for listening to my story. If it reminded you of your own strength, or of someone who taught you what integrity means, share it with them. Maybe that's how we keep building things that last.